Recently, the media has been abuzz with the question, how do we heal the divide after the election? With Thanksgiving coming, it's not surprising that many of us have the ideas of unity and peacekeeping on our mind. Many of us are probably considering doing some sort of family gathering perhaps this year, and maybe we're beginning to wonder about that one relative, the one who we meet every year, who has the tendency to try our patience just a little bit. Do we once again offer an olive branch in hopes of the best this year? Or perhaps this year we decide to rely on the safety of social distancing and give it a miss. Every year, it's the same question. Do I stay at the table to maintain a relationship, or do I leave the table for my own personal sanity? Might not surprise many of you to know that my soft heart has always leaned on the side of love, leaning towards forgiveness. After practicing this art repeatedly over the years with various family members, and of course asking in return for those family members to forgive me, I've learned that often the best way to keep the peace is to avoid certain topics of discussion altogether with my extended family. Mostly, we stay away from the topics of parenting advice and financial advice. We tend to stick to the topics that we can all agree on. Politics, luckily, for the most part, travel routes to and from Western Pennsylvania, and for the most part, the record of the Pittsburgh Steelers football team. Sticking to these simple rules keeps everything as comfortable as possible with extended family. As comfortable as one can be with extended family. And that's the key word I want us to focus on a little bit. That idea of comfort. In the interests of preserving peace, we'll often avoid what's uncomfortable. We can avoid the difficult when possible. We avoid stirring up trouble. I think a lot of us right now are really sick of trouble. It feels like lately there has been nothing but trouble for the last year. The coronavirus, the protests in the streets for racial justice, and of course, the election. I don't know about you, but I'm done. It's been at least 9 months of chaos. So can we just please get some peace and quiet? Can we have a national time out and just play nice and quietly with each other just for a little while? So I understand that call for unity after the election, because it is something that I too personally deeply long for. I understand this desire to forgive and move on because the weight of holding a grudge is exhausting. I understand the idea and desire to get things to a comfortable level because my spiritual and emotional muscles ache from holding this tension. And I understand the desire to put aside difficult topics and just sit at the table, have a nice meal, and just talk about the weather. I want to forgive and move on. It sounds so good, but in reality, it never works. Not really. Like I said, I have a few issues that I try not to discuss around certain members of extended family. And some of you may be familiar and have a similar situation. And what usually ends up happening when you promise not to talk about these topics is you bite your tongue when they come up and you just let it gnaw at you. Or you finally speak your mind and that conflict bubbles up. It's the pattern of gnawing silence or uncomfortable conflict, and it continues over and over and over again for eternity until the issue is either resolved or you decide that your opinion just isn't worth fighting about anymore. And I want to say that there are some opinions that it's okay not to fight over anymore. Some things are worth letting go. I will never, ever convince my stepfather of the greatness that is the Pittsburgh Steelers. He will forever be a Minnesota Vikings fan. And I can let that go. But some things are worth holding on to. Some things are so vital to our identity and our morality that our own silence on the topic makes us uncomfortable. That is when we need the most to stay at the table. Sometimes this term, staying at the table, conjures up feelings of keeping this precious ideal to yourself in order to save a relationship. In truth, staying at the table is much more of an active thing than that. You stay at the table after the meal has been served, after the dishes have been cleared, and after everyone else is gone. You stay at the table in order to have the difficult conversation with someone in order to get to a mutual understanding. You stay at the table in order to resolve the conflict, not to just ignore it. Now, I want to be clear about who I'm talking about here in this we stay at the table. All right? When I say we, I mean the people who would be allies. When it comes to matters of social justice and this hard work of confrontation, in this situation, I would not ask a black person to defend Black Lives Matter to a white person who considers BLM to be a terrorist group. Chances are that that white person is going to say some pretty hurtful things that no person of color should have to hear. I would not ask someone who is genderqueer to stay at the table with someone who considers them to be less than human. Confrontations like these with people on the margins and people with privilege have been shown medically to take years off of people's lives, the lives of those with marginalized identities. To ask people on the margins to stay at the table with people who want nothing but conflict with them is simply cruel. I am not asking them to stay at the table. As a person of privilege, I would not do that. I also want to talk a little bit about this idea about staying at the table. It calls for togetherness and unity. These calls of people wanting to stay at the table, these calls of people who want healing to begin, these calls I have heard mostly from mainstream privileged identities. And maybe that's just the water I swim in. Maybe I'm missing the calls from people on the margins who want to go to the table, who want to have a time of healing and put their differences aside. But I see this idea of wanting to push some of these things aside, mostly from people of privilege, people who look like myself and live in that comfortable bubble. And I'm sure everybody wants a world where everyone is treated with worth and dignity. But I have to imagine that people with marginalized identities who have been systematically oppressed are much less interested of having a thoughtful discussion about their own humanity at the table. I have to believe that people with marginalized identities are much more interested in not being shot by police, not being discriminated against for who they love, and not being persecuted for their own gender identity. For those on the margins who are fighting for their lives, the table is an afterthought. In my straight, white, male opinion, in my opinion of privilege, the table is my straight, white, male, privileged responsibility. It is the responsibility of those of us with privilege to further equity and compassion in the world, to talk to those who have privilege like us, to stay at the table and having difficult conversations with our peers of privilege is not our first responsibility even when it comes to privilege. Laura gave us a great lesson today on what that first priority should be when it comes to justice. And that first priority is to center the voices from the margins. In our story, David and Tracy saw what happened, and instead of having that difficult conversation with the bullies about how really pink is for everyone, they checked on Fam. They listened to him. They made sure he was okay. They didn't focus on how bad the bullies were. They didn't talk about how Tracy and David had also been bullied and they know exactly what that person was going through. They focused on Fam and his safety. And their second priority, after listening to him, was to form a coalition around him. They found people who would support them and their pink cause. Not just bring awareness to the issue, but to build support and take action to change the culture of anti-pinkness in this instance. Those are our first two and most important steps in justice work. Listen to those who have been hurt and oppressed by systems and build support around them. You'll notice in Laura's story, they didn't include a chapter where Tracy and David decide they want to have a heart-to-heart talk with the bullies and ask them where their pink bias comes from. They certainly didn't tell Fam in the story that he should have that heart-to-heart talk. Why do you think that is? The bullies in this tale would never come to the table in this case. They just couldn't be bothered. It's the great thing about a two-dimensional bad guy. This is the biggest thing, though, we need to remember when it comes to staying at the table. Some people don't want to come to the table. No matter how many facts you give someone, no matter how many stories you tell someone about an issue, no matter how earnest you are, no matter how much you try to connect with their humanity, there are some people who just don't want to hear it. They don't want to come to the table. And the sad thing is, friends, there is nothing you can do about it. This call for unity and forgiveness, this call for peace, the call for healing that we are all dying for, some of us quite literally, this has to come from both sides. The idea that one side can just pretend away our differences with people who don't want to hear us, that idea needs to stop. It is a toxic part of white culture that insists if we play nice and ignore it, it will go away. Those of us raised in whiteness cannot ignore our way into a just and equitable world. We of privilege will have to have some difficult conversations with our siblings of privilege if we are ever to achieve the world of peace and unity that we seek. I regret that I do not have the magic words that will convince your intractable friends that Black Lives Matter. I regret that I do not have the words that will convince them that gender fluidity isn't a passing fad. I regret that I don't have the words to convince people that the system of policing in this country is deeply flawed and broken. If I had those words to convince people of this, I would put them in every newspaper, on every radio station, on every television show. I would write them on pieces of scrap paper and hand them out on the metro. I would tattoo them on my forehead. But there simply are no magic words to change the hearts and minds. There is just us. Just the people of privilege maintaining relationships with those who are our privileged peer group. So for my friends of privilege, the only way you're going to change anyone's mind is to be in relationship with them. Now, I want you to know that doesn't mean compromising your values. I hope the one thing you take away from this is you cannot be silenced in order to just maintain the peace. Just the opposite when you're in relationship with these people. You still need to voice your disdain for systems of oppression. You still need to let them know when they say or do things that prop up these systems. And if that relationship that the two of you have, if it is important to the both of you, and you both want that relationship to survive and even to thrive, you will both come to the table and sit and have the difficult conversations. If both parties have a desire to listen and work towards peace, you have a chance of coming to a good resolution. And I encourage you, if you have those relationships, to use them. But if you don't have goodwill on both sides, it's okay to walk away. There's no sense in getting angry or hurt and depressed. There's no sense in arguing until you turn blue for nothing. It's okay to say, I cannot be in this relationship with you. I want us all to play nice. I really do. I want to stop living in a world that is always on fire. I want to stop marching and protesting and writing letters to elected officials. And I want to stop having difficult family conversations. I am so tired of it all. But those on the margins have been fighting these systems of oppression for centuries. And while we of privilege are fighting for justice, those who have been oppressed are fighting for their lives. So like David and Tracy, listen to their voices. When called, wear your pink shirt. Encourage your friends to do the same. Because in order for there to be peace and justice in this world, in order for things to really, truly quiet down, we need to work for justice first. After that, we can, all of us, sit at the table.